At some point in your life, you will realize that what hurt you the most is no longer happening, yet the pain is still alive inside you. The words were spoken long ago, the people have already moved on, the moment has passed, and still your heart feels heavy. Buddhism teaches that suffering does not come from what happened, but from what you continue to carry. When you hold pain tightly, it follows you everywhere. But when you learn to let go deeply, not with force, not with anger, but with understanding, something extraordinary happens. The world does not become gentle, but you become unbreakable. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you may discover that nothing outside of you has ever truly had the power to hurt you. 1. Suffering begins when attachment refuses to end. Buddhism teaches us something very gentle, yet very powerful. Pain is a natural part of being human, but suffering is something the mind creates when it refuses to let go. Pain happens in moments, but suffering continues in memory. You do not suffer simply because someone walked away from your life. You suffer because your mind keeps returning to that moment again and again, replaying the words, the silence, the disappointment, and asking questions that no longer have answers. You do not suffer because life changed. You suffer because you expected it not to. The heart clings to how things were, how people used to treat you, how safe something once felt, and when reality moves forward, the mind stays behind, gripping the past tightly. Attachment binds your inner peace to things that were never stable to begin with. You attach your happiness to people who are changing, to outcomes you cannot control, to roles and identities that shift with time. When those things move, your peace collapses with them. The Buddha taught that everything in existence is impermanent, not as a harsh truth, but as a compassionate reminder. Emotions rise and fall, relationships evolve or end, circumstances transform, and even the person you were yesterday is no longer the same today. When you forget this truth and cling to what is temporary as if it were permanent, the mind resists reality. That resistance creates tension, fear, anger, and sorrow, and this inner resistance is the true source of suffering. Suffering does not come from loss itself, but from the refusal to accept that loss is part of life. When you say inside your heart, "This should not have happened," or "This should have lasted forever," you create a battle between what is and what you wish still existed. Letting go deeply means ending that battle. It means understanding, not just intellectually, but emotionally, that nothing was ever meant to be owned, controlled, or frozen in time. People were meant to walk with you for a while, not forever. Moments were meant to pass, not stay. Life was meant to flow, not pause for your comfort. When attachment loosens, something beautiful happens. The mind stops fighting reality, and peace slowly returns. You no longer chase what has already gone, and you no longer fear what might leave next. Suffering loses its fuel because you are no longer feeding it with resistance. In this space of acceptance, the heart becomes lighter, calmer, and more resilient. You still feel emotions, you still care deeply, but you are no longer trapped by the need for things to remain unchanged. This is where true inner freedom begins. 2. Letting go is not forgetting, it is no longer carrying. Many people believe that letting go means forgetting what happened, erasing memories, or pretending that the pain never mattered. Buddhism teaches something much kinder and more realistic. Letting go does not mean denying your experience, and it does not mean saying that what hurt you was acceptable. Letting go means you stop carrying the emotional weight of the past everywhere you go. The event may still exist in memory, but it no longer controls your thoughts, your reactions, or your sense of self. You remember without reopening the wound, and this is where healing truly begins. When you refuse to let go, the past becomes heavy. You carry old conversations, old betrayals, old disappointments, and old regrets into moments that have nothing to do with them. You react to the present through the pain of yesterday, and slowly, without realizing it, your life becomes smaller. Buddhism teaches that holding on to pain does not protect you, it imprisons you. The mind believes that by holding the memory tightly, it will prevent the same hurt from happening again, but in reality, it only keeps you trapped in the moment that already passed. Letting go deeply means allowing the memory to exist without letting it define you. It means saying, "This happened, and it affected me, but it does not get to follow me forever." The experience transforms from a source of suffering into a source of wisdom. You no longer relive it emotionally, you understand it calmly. This is why the Buddha taught mindfulness, the practice of observing thoughts and memories without clinging to them. When a memory arises, you notice it, you acknowledge it, and then you gently release it instead of feeding it with emotion, judgment, or self-blame. Many people unknowingly turn their pain into identity. They define themselves by what they lost, who hurt them, or what went wrong. Letting go breaks this cycle. You are no longer the one who was abandoned, the one who was betrayed, or the one who failed. You become someone who experienced pain and grew wiser because of it. This shift is subtle but powerful. The heart softens, the mind becomes quieter, and life begins to feel lighter, even though nothing external has changed. Buddhism reminds us that carrying pain longer than necessary is not strength, it is habit. True strength is the willingness to put the burden down. When you stop carrying what no longer belongs to the present moment, you create space for peace, clarity, and compassion. You still remember, but you are no longer wounded by the memory. This is the art of letting go, not forcefully, not suddenly, but gently and completely until the past loses its grip on your heart. 3. Nothing hurts you directly. The mind interprets everything. One of the deepest and most liberating teachings in Buddhism is the understanding that nothing hurts you directly. What you experience as suffering is not created by the event itself, but by how the mind interprets, repeats, and holds on to that event. Two people can experience the same loss, the same rejection, the same harsh words, or the same failure, yet one remains peaceful while the other suffers deeply for years. The difference is not what happened, but how the mind responded to it. The mind gives meaning to every experience, and that meaning determines whether pain turns into wisdom or into long-lasting suffering. When something painful happens, the body may react immediately with shock, sadness, or fear, and this is natural. Buddhism does not deny this initial response. What creates suffering is what comes after. The mind begins to replay the moment, analyze it, judge it, and attach stories to it. It says things like, "This should not have happened," "I was treated unfairly," "I am not enough," or "This ruined my life." These thoughts feel real and convincing, but they are not facts. They are interpretations. The more the mind repeats these stories, the more solid the pain becomes, even though the original event has already ended. The Buddha taught that the mind is like a lens through which reality is seen. If the lens is clouded by fear, attachment, and expectation, then everything appears painful and threatening. When the lens is clear, the same experiences are seen as passing moments, not permanent wounds. This is why Buddhism places such importance on awareness. When you become aware of your thoughts, you begin to notice that suffering is not constant. It rises and falls depending on where the mind is resting. When the mind clings to the past or worries about the future, suffering increases. When the mind returns to the present moment, suffering softens. Letting go deeply at this level means learning to observe your thoughts instead of obeying them. A painful thought may arise, but you do not have to follow it. You can notice it, acknowledge it, and allow it to pass without building an entire identity around it. The thought loses power when it is no longer believed automatically. You begin to see that thoughts are events in the mind, just like sounds in the ear or sensations in the body. They appear, they stay briefly, and they disappear unless you hold on to them. This understanding changes everything. When someone speaks harshly to you, the sound of their words lasts only a few seconds. What hurts you for days or years is the meaning you attach to those words. When something ends, the ending itself is brief. What keeps hurting is the story you tell yourself about what that ending means about you, your worth, or your future. When you see this clearly, you regain your power. You realize that peace does not depend on controlling others or preventing difficult experiences. Peace depends on how you relate to your own mind. Buddhism teaches that freedom comes when you stop arguing with reality inside your head. When you stop demanding that life should have unfolded differently, the mind relaxes. This does not mean you approve of everything that happened. It means you stop letting it live rent-free in your awareness. You stop feeding pain with constant attention. Instead, you gently return to the present moment, where most suffering does not actually exist. Over time, this practice transforms how you experience life. Situations that once triggered deep emotional reactions begin to feel lighter. You still notice them, but they no longer shake you in the same way. You respond instead of react. You understand that thoughts are not commands and emotions are not permanent states. They are passing experiences, just like clouds moving across the sky. When the mind stops clinging to every thought as truth, suffering loses its grip. Letting go deeply at this level is not about suppressing emotions or pretending you are unaffected. It is about clarity. It is about seeing that the mind has been adding layers of suffering that were never necessary. When you remove those layers, what remains is a quiet strength, a grounded presence, and an inner stability that does not depend on circumstances. This is how you reach a place where nothing can truly hurt you anymore, not because life stops being challenging, but because the mind stops turning challenges into lifelong wounds. 4. True detachment is loving without possessing. Many people misunderstand detachment and believe it means becoming cold, distant, or emotionally closed. Buddhism teaches something far more compassionate and balanced. True detachment does not mean that you stop loving, caring, or forming connections. It means you stop trying to possess people, moments, and outcomes as if they belong to you. Possession creates fear, and fear is what makes love painful. When you believe that someone must stay the same, must always choose you, or must never change, you place a heavy burden on both yourself and them. Detachment removes that burden and allows love to exist freely. Attachment says, "You complete me," while detachment says, "I am whole, and I choose to share my life with you." When your happiness depends on how someone behaves, speaks, or stays, you become emotionally vulnerable in an unhealthy way. Any shift in their behavior feels like a threat. Buddhism teaches that this kind of attachment turns love into anxiety. Detachment, on the other hand, allows you to love deeply without fear of loss dominating your heart. You carefully, but you do not collapse if the relationship changes or ends. True detachment begins with understanding impermanence. People grow, circumstances evolve, and life moves in ways that no one can control. When you accept this truth, love becomes lighter. You stop gripping, questioning, and monitoring. You allow people to be who they are without trying to freeze them in a version that once made you feel safe. This does not make love weaker, it makes it purer. Love without possession is not based on fear, but on presence. Buddhism teaches that when you cling to relationships, you suffer twice. You suffer when things are good because you fear losing them, and you suffer when things change because you feel abandoned. Detachment frees you from both forms of suffering. You enjoy what is present without worrying about how long it will last. You are grateful instead of anxious. You are connected instead of dependent. This shift is subtle, but it changes the entire emotional experience of love. Detachment also protects your inner peace. When someone leaves, disappoints you, or behaves in ways you did not expect, your world does not collapse. You feel sadness, but not destruction. You feel loss, but not emptiness. This is because your identity and worth were never built on their presence. Buddhism teaches that when you anchor your sense of self within, no one has the power to take your peace away. Loving without possessing also means releasing the need to control outcomes. You stop trying to force people to heal, change, or meet your expectations. You allow life to unfold naturally. This does not mean you tolerate disrespect or harm. Detachment includes wisdom. You can walk away from what harms you without hatred and without clinging to resentment. This is one of the highest forms of emotional maturity. As detachment deepens, relationships become more honest. You no longer love out of fear of loneliness or abandonment. You love because your heart is open. You give because you want to, not because you are afraid to lose someone. This kind of love is calm, stable, and deeply nourishing. It does not exhaust you. It does not consume you. It supports growth rather than dependency. In Buddhism, true freedom in relationships comes when you stop holding people too tightly. When nothing is possessed, nothing can be taken from you. When love is free, it no longer wounds you in the same way. You become emotionally resilient, grounded, and peaceful, even in the face of change. This is how detachment becomes not a loss of love, but the highest expression of it. 5. Letting go happens in the present, not the past. Many people believe that in order to let go, something must first change in the past. They wait for an apology that never comes, an explanation that will finally make everything make sense, or a moment of closure that feels complete and satisfying. Buddhism teaches that this waiting is one of the most subtle forms of attachment. When you tie your peace to something that has already passed, you give the past control over your present. The past cannot be changed, corrected, or negotiated with, yet the mind keeps returning there, hoping that one more thought, one more memory, or one more imagined conversation will bring relief. Instead, it brings exhaustion. Letting go does not happen by rewriting what happened. It happens by changing your relationship with what happened. The Buddha taught that peace is found only in the present moment, because this is the only place where life is actually happening. When the mind is trapped in the past, it is reliving pain that no longer exists. When it is trapped in the future, it is creating fear that has not yet arrived. Letting go deeply means gently guiding the mind back to now, again and again, until it learns that safety and calm are already here. Many people hold on because they believe that letting go means accepting injustice, betrayal, or loss as okay. Buddhism teaches something more honest. Letting go does not mean approving of what hurt you. It means releasing the belief that your peace depends on understanding why it happened. Some experiences will never make sense, and some people will never acknowledge the pain they caused. When you wait for them to do so, you remain emotionally tied to them. Letting go deeply is the act of choosing freedom over explanation. The present moment is where release begins. In the present, you can breathe without pain replaying itself. In the present, you can feel your body, hear sounds around you, and notice that right now, in this exact moment, you are surviving. Buddhism teaches mindfulness because mindfulness interrupts the habit of mental time travel. Each time you return to the present, you weaken the grip of the past. Slowly, the mind learns that it does not need to keep revisiting old wounds to stay safe. Letting go in the present also means releasing the need for emotional resolution. Many people believe that healing must feel dramatic or complete. In reality, healing often feels quiet. It feels like fewer thoughts about what happened. It feels like longer spaces of peace between memories. It feels like caring less about answers and more about calm. Buddhism teaches that peace does not arrive all at once. It unfolds naturally as attachment dissolves. Another hidden attachment is the belief that holding on honors what was lost. The mind says, if I let go, it means it didn't matter. Buddhism gently corrects this misunderstanding. Letting go does not erase meaning, it releases suffering. You can honor what was by allowing it to rest in the past instead of dragging it into every new moment. The past becomes a teacher, not a prison. When you stop searching the past for relief, something shifts inside you. The present moment begins to feel spacious. You are no longer pulled backward by regret or forward by fear. You start living again, not perfectly, but honestly. This is why Buddhism emphasizes acceptance. Acceptance is not surrender to pain, it is surrender to reality. When you accept what is, the mind stops fighting and suffering begins to dissolve. Letting go deeply in the present is a daily practice. Some days the mind will return to old stories, and that is okay. Each time it does, you gently bring it back. There is no force, no judgment, and no rush. Over time, the mind learns that it is safe to release. The heart softens, and peace becomes more stable. This is how letting go truly happens, not through the past changing, but through the present becoming your home. When you fully arrive here, the past loses its power, and nothing can hurt you in the same way again. 6. When you release control, life stops fighting you. One of the deepest reasons human beings suffer is the constant attempt to control life. Control over people, control over outcomes, control over timing, control over how things should unfold. Buddhism teaches that this desire for control is rooted in fear, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of loss, and the fear of pain. The mind believes that if it can control enough variables, it can avoid suffering. But life does not work that way. Life is fluid, unpredictable, and constantly changing. The more tightly you try to grip it, the more it resists you, and this resistance becomes exhaustion, frustration, and emotional pain. When something does not go according to your expectations, the mind immediately reacts. It says, "This should not be happening," "This is unfair," or "I need to fix this right now." Buddhism teaches that this inner argument with reality is the true source of suffering. Reality does not argue back. It simply continues to unfold. The fight happens entirely inside your mind. Letting go deeply means ending this internal struggle. It means allowing life to move as it does, without constantly trying to bend it into a shape that feels safe or familiar. Releasing control does not mean becoming passive or careless. Buddhism does not teach helplessness. It teaches wise action without attachment to results. You still act, you still choose, you still move forward, but you no longer demand that life rewards you in a specific way. You do your part, and then you let life respond as it will. When you release control at this level, the constant tension in the body begins to soften, the shoulders relax, the breath deepens, and the heart feels less guarded. This physical relaxation is a sign that the mind has stopped fighting what it cannot command. Many people confuse control with responsibility. They believe that if they stop controlling, everything will fall apart. Buddhism gently reveals that much of what you try to control was never actually under your command. Other people's emotions, choices, healing, and awareness are not yours to manage. When you try to carry responsibility for what belongs to others, you drain yourself emotionally. Letting go deeply means returning responsibility to where it belongs. You take care of your intentions, your actions, and your inner state, and you release the rest. One of the hardest things to release is the need to control outcomes. The mind says, if I do everything right, things should work out the way I want. Buddhism teaches that outcomes are shaped by countless conditions, many of which are invisible and beyond your influence. When you attach your peace to a specific outcome, you live in constant anxiety. Every delay feels like failure. Every change feels like threat. Releasing control over outcomes frees you from this constant emotional instability. You learn to accept success without clinging and loss without collapsing. When you stop trying to control how people see you, another layer of suffering dissolves. Many people suffer because they want to be understood, appreciated, validated, or remembered in a certain way. Buddhism teaches that chasing approval ties your identity to opinions that change constantly. When you release the need to control how others perceive you, your sense of self becomes steadier. You no longer rise and fall with praise or criticism. You become rooted within yourself. Releasing control also changes how you experience uncertainty. Instead of seeing uncertainty as danger, you begin to see it as openness. The future no longer feels like a threat that must be managed. It becomes a space of possibility. Buddhism teaches that clinging to certainty is another form of attachment. When you accept that you do not need to know how everything will unfold, the mind relaxes into trust. This trust is not blind optimism. It is confidence in your ability to meet whatever arises with awareness and presence. As control loosens, something profound happens. Life stops pushing back. Situations still arise, but they no longer feel like personal attacks. You respond instead of react. You adapt instead of resist. You learn when to act and when to step back. This flexibility is a form of wisdom. The Buddha taught that suffering decreases when resistance decreases. When you stop insisting that life should match your expectations, peace begins to grow naturally. Letting go deeply at this level also transforms fear. Fear thrives on the illusion that you must manage everything to stay safe. When you release control, fear loses its foundation. You realize that safety does not come from controlling life, but from being present with it. You trust your awareness more than your plans. You trust your resilience more than your predictions. Over time, releasing control becomes a way of living. You stop gripping people emotionally. You stop forcing timelines. You stop replaying scenarios in your mind. You become calmer not because life becomes easier, but because you stop adding unnecessary struggle to it. This calmness is not indifference, it is clarity. When you no longer fight reality, reality no longer feels like an enemy. Life becomes something you move with, not against. This is the quiet strength Buddhism points to. A strength that does not dominate, but flows. A peace that does not depend on conditions. When control is released, suffering has nowhere to attach itself. You remain steady even when things change. This is how letting go protects you. Not by shielding you from life, but by freeing you from the need to control it. When life is no longer something you wrestle with, nothing can break you in the same way again. 7. When nothing is held tightly, nothing can break you. At the deepest level of Buddhist understanding, freedom comes not from changing life, but from changing how tightly you hold it. What ultimately breaks people is not loss itself, but attachment to what was never guaranteed to stay. When you hold people, identities, outcomes, and expectations too tightly, you create fear beneath the surface of your life. Fear of losing, fear of change, fear of becoming nothing without what you are holding. Buddhism teaches that this fear is the final root of suffering, and that liberation begins the moment you loosen your grip. Most people move through life carrying invisible contracts in their heart. They believe that if they love enough, sacrifice enough, behave correctly, or endure patiently, life will reward them with stability and certainty. When reality breaks these silent agreements, the heart feels betrayed. But Buddhism teaches that life never signed those contracts. Everything that comes into your life is conditional, temporary, and dependent on countless causes beyond your control. When you understand this deeply, not intellectually but emotionally, disappointment begins to lose its power over you. What hurts you is what you believe you cannot live without. When your identity is built on being chosen, you break when you are rejected. When your worth depends on success, you break when you fail. When your peace depends on control, you break when uncertainty arrives. Letting go deeply means untangling your sense of self from these external conditions. You begin to see that you are still whole, even when things fall apart. You are still complete, even when plans dissolve. This realization is not dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and deeply grounding. Buddhism teaches that clinging is exhausting because it requires constant vigilance. You must monitor, protect, defend, and manage what you are attached to. You worry about losing it, changing it, or not being enough to keep it. This constant mental effort drains your energy and narrows your life. When you let go deeply, the mind finally rests. You stop guarding your happiness like something fragile. You stop living in fear of loss. Peace becomes something you carry within, not something you negotiate with the world. When nothing is held tightly, pain still arises, but it does not shatter you. You feel sadness without despair. You feel disappointment without bitterness. You feel loss without losing yourself. Buddhism does not promise a life without pain. It offers a way to experience pain without being destroyed by it. This resilience does not come from hardening the heart, but from softening attachment. The softer your grip, the less life can wound you. This is why deeply liberated people appear calm, even in difficulty. They are not numb, and they are not detached from life. They are simply not clinging to how things should be. They allow life to arrive and depart without resistance. When joy comes, they enjoy it fully. When it leaves, they bow and let it go. This balance is not indifference. It is wisdom. It is understanding that everything has its season, and no season defines the whole of life. Letting go deeply also dissolves resentment. Resentment is attachment to how someone should have been. It is the refusal to release an image of the past that no longer exists. When you let go deeply, you stop demanding that people become who you needed them to be. You accept who they were, who they are, and who they may never become. This acceptance does not excuse harm. It frees you from carrying anger that poisons your own peace. As attachment loosens, gratitude replaces fear. You stop measuring life by how long things last and begin appreciating them for having existed at all. Relationships become gifts instead of guarantees. Moments become experiences instead of possessions. Even pain becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. Buddhism teaches that when you stop demanding permanence, you discover abundance everywhere. At this depth, letting go also transforms how you face uncertainty and death. The fear of endings softens because you no longer see endings as personal failures. You see them as part of the natural rhythm of existence. Birth and death, gain and loss, coming and going, all belong to the same movement of life. When you stop resisting this movement, you stop feeling personally attacked by change. Nothing can break you when your happiness is not built on fragile foundations, when your peace does not depend on outcomes, when your identity is not tied to roles that can be taken away. When your worth is not measured by what you have or who stays, Buddhism teaches that the unbreakable mind is not rigid but flexible. It bends without shattering. It adapts without losing itself. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You still love deeply, but you do not chain your survival to love's permanence. You still strive, but you do not collapse when efforts fail. You still dream, but you do not lose yourself when dreams change. This balance is the heart of Buddhist freedom. Over time, this way of being changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less defensive, and less afraid. You listen more, you accept more. You speak from calm rather than urgency. Life feels less like a battlefield and more like a flowing river. You learn when to step forward and when to release. You trust yourself to meet whatever comes. When nothing is held tightly, nothing can be taken from you in a way that destroys you. Loss still happens, but it no longer defines you. Pain still visits, but it no longer rules you. Change still arrives, but it no longer terrifies you. You stand steady, not because life is stable, but because you are. This is the final depth of letting go that Buddhism points toward. Not escape from life, but freedom within it. Not immunity from pain, but liberation from suffering. When the heart releases its grip, life can no longer wound it in the same way. And in that release, you discover a quiet, unshakable peace that nothing can break. 8. Freedom is not becoming untouchable. It is becoming empty enough to feel everything without being owned by it. At the deepest stage of letting go, Buddhism reveals a truth that can feel unsettling at first, yet incredibly liberating once understood. Freedom is not about becoming hardened, distant, or emotionally unreachable. It is not about building walls so thick that nothing can enter. True freedom is not numbness. True freedom is emptiness. Not an empty life, but an empty grasp, an empty need, an empty attachment to how things must feel, how people must behave, and how life must unfold. When you become empty in this way, everything can touch you, yet nothing can own you. Many people believe the goal of letting go is to stop feeling pain. Buddhism teaches something far more subtle. Pain will still arise, sadness will still visit, joy will still appear and disappear. What changes is not the presence of emotion, but your relationship to it. When the heart is empty of clinging, emotions move through you like weather through open space. A storm may pass, but it does not become your identity. The sky is not damaged by the clouds that cross it. In the same way, when you let go deeply, emotions no longer define who you are. Suffering continues only when emotions are grasped, labeled, judged, and held tightly. The mind says, "I should not feel this," or "This feeling means something is wrong with me," or "This pain will last forever." Buddhism teaches that these thoughts are the final layer of suffering. When you release them, emotions lose their sharpness. Sadness becomes sadness, not despair. Fear becomes fear, not panic. Joy becomes joy, not something you must cling to out of fear that it will vanish. Emptiness allows experience without ownership. At this depth, letting go means releasing the need to protect yourself from life. Many people spend their lives bracing, guarding, anticipating pain before it arrives. This constant self-protection creates tension in the body and mind. Buddhism teaches that the self you are trying to protect is not as fragile as you believe. When you stop defending against every possible hurt, you discover that awareness itself is resilient. You can feel deeply without breaking. You can experience loss without losing yourself. This emptiness is not coldness. It is openness. An open heart feels more, not less. But it does not cling. It does not demand that feelings stay or leave. It allows experience to unfold naturally. When love arrives, it is welcomed fully. When love ends, it is released without hatred. When happiness appears, it is enjoyed without fear. When sorrow arises, it is met with compassion instead of resistance. This is the highest form of emotional maturity Buddhism offers. Buddhism teaches that the sense of I that feels hurt is often constructed around attachment. The mind says, "This happened to me. This defines me. This should not have happened to someone like me." When you let go deeply, this rigid sense of self softens. Experience still happens, but it no longer feels personal in the same painful way. Life unfolds, emotions arise, and awareness remains steady. You realize that you are not the story, you are the space in which the story appears. At this level, forgiveness happens naturally without effort. Not because others deserve it, but because holding on no longer makes sense. Anger requires energy, resentment requires memory, hatred requires repetition. When the heart becomes empty of clinging, these states dissolve on their own. You stop replaying, you stop rehearsing, you stop reliving. Peace is not forced. It is revealed. Emptiness also changes how you experience joy. Joy no longer becomes something you chase or fear losing. It becomes something you receive fully, knowing it will pass, and appreciating it more deeply because of that truth. Buddhism teaches that impermanence does not make life meaningless. It makes it precious. When you stop demanding permanence, every moment becomes enough. When nothing is owned, life feels lighter. You stop carrying emotional baggage from one moment to the next. You stop defining yourself by what happened yesterday. You stop projecting fear into tomorrow. You live more fully here. This presence is the foundation of peace. Not peace as an emotion, but peace as a state of being. At this depth, even the fear of being hurt dissolves. You realize that pain does not destroy awareness. Loss does not erase being. Change does not end you. The fear that once controlled your decisions loses its grip. You stop avoiding life in order to feel safe. You start living openly, honestly, and gently. Buddhism teaches that the most unshakable person is not the one who feels nothing, but the one who feels everything without clinging. This person cannot be easily manipulated, controlled, or broken, because there is nothing inside them that must be protected at all costs. Their peace does not depend on comfort. Their worth does not depend on approval. Their happiness does not depend on certainty. This is the final release, not the release of emotion, but the release of ownership. When you no longer say, "This feeling is me," or "This experience defines me," suffering loses its final hold. Life continues, but it no longer wounds you in the same way. When you become empty in this way, you are not hollow. You are free, free to feel, free to love, free to lose, free to begin again. Nothing is blocked, and nothing is held. In this openness, nothing can truly hurt you, because nothing stays long enough to become a prison. This is the quiet freedom Buddhism points toward, not escape from the world, but complete openness within it. When the heart lets go completely, life touches you, but it no longer owns you. And in that emptiness, you discover the deepest peace a human being can know. 9. Peace appears when you stop asking life to be fair and start allowing it to be real. One of the most hidden sources of suffering is the belief that life should be fair, predictable, and balanced according to our personal sense of justice. Buddhism gently teaches that this belief, while understandable, quietly keeps the heart in conflict with reality. Life does not unfold according to fairness as the mind imagines it. Good people suffer. Unkind people sometimes prosper. Effort does not always lead to reward, and patience is not always met with understanding. When the mind insists that life should behave differently than it does, suffering becomes constant, because reality never signs an agreement with expectations. Many people carry an invisible question inside their heart that repeats endlessly. Why did this happen to me? Why was I treated this way? Why did I give so much and receive so little? These questions feel natural, but Buddhism teaches that they quietly bind you to pain. Each time you ask them, the mind returns to comparison, judgment, and resistance. The heart argues with the past, and the present moment becomes poisoned by unresolved expectations. Letting go deeply at this level means releasing the demand that life explain itself to you. This does not mean that injustice becomes acceptable or that suffering is dismissed. Buddhism does not deny harm or pain. It simply teaches that clinging to the idea of fairness keeps the wound open. When you believe that something should not have happened, the mind keeps reliving it in search of moral balance. But life is not a courtroom. It does not deliver verdicts that satisfy the wounded heart. When you stop asking life to be fair, something inside you relaxes. You stop fighting what already happened. The expectation of fairness often hides another attachment, the attachment to identity. The mind says, "Someone like me should not experience this," or "After everything I have done, I deserve better." Buddhism teaches that suffering becomes heavier when it is personalized. When pain becomes proof of something being wrong with you or with the world, it deepens. Letting go means allowing experience to be experience, without attaching it to self-worth, moral deserving, or cosmic punishment. When you release the demand for fairness, you stop measuring life constantly. You stop comparing your journey to others. You stop asking why their life looks easier or why your path feels heavier. Comparison feeds resentment, and resentment quietly steals peace. Buddhism teaches that every life unfolds under different conditions, shaped by causes and effects that are mostly invisible. When you stop comparing, you stop suffering unnecessarily. This release also transforms how you carry disappointment. Disappointment arises when reality fails to meet expectation. When expectations soften, disappointment loses its intensity. You still notice when things do not go as planned, but you no longer collapse emotionally. You adjust, you adapt, you continue. This flexibility is a form of wisdom. The Buddha taught that rigidity creates suffering, while flexibility allows peace. Letting go of fairness also means releasing the hope that the past will be corrected. Many people wait for karma to act in a visible way, for apologies to arrive, or for others to finally understand the pain they caused. While these things may happen, Buddhism teaches that tying your peace to them keeps you emotionally dependent. When you stop waiting for external resolution, you reclaim your inner freedom. You are no longer paused, waiting for life to catch up to your expectations. As this understanding deepens, compassion naturally grows. You begin to see that others are also struggling under conditions they did not choose. Their actions often come from their own fear, confusion, and suffering. This does not excuse harm, but it dissolves hatred. When you understand that life is not fair to anyone in the way the mind expects, forgiveness becomes easier. Not forced forgiveness, but release. At this depth, peace becomes quieter and more stable. You stop demanding explanations. You stop rehearsing arguments with the past. You stop trying to balance invisible scales. Instead, you meet life as it is, moment by moment. This acceptance does not make you passive. It makes you present. You act when action is needed, and you release when release is required. Buddhism teaches that true peace does not come from life becoming just, but from the heart becoming flexible. When you allow life to be real instead of fair, you stop being disappointed by its nature. You stop feeling personally targeted by its unpredictability. You understand that suffering is not a punishment, and joy is not a reward. They are experiences that arise and pass. This realization removes a deep layer of bitterness. Bitterness grows when expectations remain unmet for too long. When expectations dissolve, bitterness has nothing to attach to. The heart becomes softer, the mind becomes quieter. Life feels less heavy, even though nothing external has changed. When you stop asking life to be fair, gratitude begins to replace resentment. You appreciate moments not because they were guaranteed, but because they happened at all. You learn to receive what comes without demanding more or less. This balance creates contentment, not excitement, not constant happiness, but a steady acceptance that carries you through both joy and difficulty. This is how letting go reaches maturity. You stop fighting reality with ideas of how things should have been. You stop measuring your worth through outcomes. You stop comparing your journey to others. You allow life to be exactly what it is without adding mental resistance. In this space, peace arises naturally. Nothing hurts as deeply when you stop demanding fairness, because pain is no longer personalized. Loss is no longer interpreted as failure. Change is no longer seen as betrayal. Life becomes a movement you participate in, not a judge you argue with. This is the freedom Buddhism points toward. Not the freedom of having life behave perfectly, but the freedom of no longer being at war with it. When you allow life to be real, exactly as it is, suffering loses one of its final foundations, and in that allowance, peace quietly settles into the heart. 10. When you no longer need life to feel complete, nothing has power over you. At the deepest point of letting go, Buddhism reveals a truth that quietly dissolves the last layer of suffering. The final attachment is not to people, memories, pain, or outcomes. The final attachment is the belief that something outside of you must change for you to feel whole. As long as the heart believes that peace depends on a future moment, a healed relationship, a perfect version of yourself, or a life without struggle, suffering continues quietly in the background. True freedom begins when you stop waiting for life to complete you and realize that completeness has always been here. Many people move through life with an invisible sense of lack. They believe something is missing, something that must be achieved, fixed, healed, forgiven, or proven before they can finally rest. Buddhism teaches that this belief keeps the mind restless. The moment one desire is fulfilled, another appears. The moment one problem is solved, another replaces it. The search for completion never ends because it is built on the false assumption that wholeness lives somewhere else. Letting go deeply at this level means releasing the need for life to resolve itself before you allow yourself to be at peace. This does not mean you stop growing or caring. It means you stop postponing peace. You stop saying, "I will be calm when things improve," or "I will be happy when I become someone better," or "I will rest when life finally makes sense." Buddhism teaches that peace is not the reward at the end of effort. It is the ground from which wise effort arises. When you understand this, striving becomes lighter. You still move forward, but you are no longer chasing yourself. The belief that something is missing also creates fear. Fear of losing progress, fear of making mistakes, fear of falling behind, fear of not becoming who you think you should be. Buddhism teaches that this fear is rooted in identification with an incomplete self-image. When you let go of the idea that you must become something else to be enough, fear loosens its grip. You become willing to meet life as you are, instead of constantly preparing to be worthy of it. At this depth, letting go means releasing the inner pressure to fix yourself. Many people believe they must heal every wound, resolve every emotion, and understand every part of their past before they can feel peace. Buddhism teaches that awareness does not need perfection to be free. You can be incomplete and still be whole. You can be healing and still be at peace. When you stop turning yourself into a project, the heart relaxes. Growth happens naturally, without force. When life no longer needs to feel complete, suffering loses its final foundation. Loss still happens, but it no longer feels like something essential was taken from you. Change still occurs, but it no longer threatens your sense of self. Failure still visits, but it no longer defines your worth. You remain grounded because your peace is not built on conditions. This understanding also transforms how you relate to time. You stop living for a future version of yourself. You stop replaying the past in search of resolution. You begin to live more fully in the present, not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is required to be. Buddhism teaches that the present moment is complete as it is. When you rest in this truth, time loosens its hold on you. At this level, gratitude becomes effortless. You are no longer grateful because life is easy, but because life is happening. You stop demanding meaning from every experience. You allow moments to be simple. Silence becomes enough. Breathing becomes enough. Existing becomes enough. This simplicity is not dullness. It is freedom from excess. When nothing is needed to complete you, relationships change. You no longer cling out of fear of emptiness. You no longer stay where you are unseen. You no longer beg for understanding. You choose connection from fullness rather than need. This makes love calmer, cleaner, and less painful. You give without losing yourself. You receive without dependency. This final letting go also dissolves the fear of being alone. Solitude no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like presence. When you are no longer waiting for something to fill you, you can sit with yourself without discomfort. Buddhism teaches that loneliness comes from resistance to one's own experience. When resistance dissolves, solitude becomes peaceful. At this depth, the question, "Why did this happen to me?" quietly fades. Not because you found the answer, but because you no longer need one. Life does not have to justify itself for you to be at peace. This is not resignation. It is maturity. The heart no longer argues with existence. When you stop needing life to complete you, control dissolves naturally. You are no longer trying to manage outcomes to feel safe. You trust yourself to meet whatever arises. This trust is not arrogance. It is familiarity with impermanence. You know things will change, and you know you will remain. This is the final unbinding. The self relaxes, the struggle softens, the search ends, not because everything was found, but because nothing was missing. You still experience joy and pain, gain and loss, beginnings and endings, but they no longer define you. Nothing has power over you when you no longer demand that life be different for you to feel whole. Nothing can truly hurt you when your peace does not depend on circumstances. This is not escape from the world. It is freedom within it. This is what it means to let go completely, not to disappear, but to arrive fully, not to become empty of life, but to become free of unnecessary suffering. When you stop waiting to be complete, you realize that you have been whole all along. 11. When you stop resisting what is, life becomes gentle with you. At the deepest point of letting go, there is one final movement the heart must make, the release of resistance itself. Resistance is subtle. It does not always appear as anger or rejection. Sometimes it appears as quiet tension, constant mental commentary, subtle disappointment, or the feeling that life should be slightly different than it is right now. Buddhism teaches that suffering continues not because pain exists, but because the mind resists pain's presence. When resistance dissolves, even difficult moments lose their sharpness. Most human beings live with a constant inner push against reality. The mind is always correcting, adjusting, judging, and negotiating with the present moment. It says, this moment should be easier, this feeling should not be here, this person should understand me, this phase should be over by now. These thoughts feel harmless, but they quietly create a state of inner struggle. Life continues to unfold, but the heart is never fully here. Buddhism teaches that this resistance is what exhausts the soul, not life itself. Letting go deeply at this level does not mean approving of everything that happens. It means ending the habit of fighting the present moment. When pain arises, you allow it to be there without demanding that it leave immediately. When uncertainty appears, you sit with it without rushing to escape. When sadness visits, you make space for it instead of labeling it as failure. This allowance does not increase suffering, it softens it. Resistance tightens pain, acceptance loosens it. The Buddha taught that the present moment is always workable, even when it is uncomfortable. What makes moments unbearable is the belief that they should not exist. When you stop arguing with the moment, it stops feeling like an enemy. You begin to experience life directly, instead of through layers of mental judgment. The body relaxes, the breath deepens. The mind becomes quieter. This is not forced calm, it is natural stillness returning. Resistance also keeps identity rigid. The mind says, I should not be the kind of person who feels this way. I should be stronger, calmer, more healed by now. Buddhism teaches that this self-judgment is another form of attachment. Attachment to an image of who you think you should be. When you release this image, compassion arises. You allow yourself to be human without punishment. Growth becomes gentle instead of harsh. As resistance dissolves, emotional pain transforms. It no longer feels like a personal failure. It feels like weather passing through awareness. Sadness comes and goes. Fear rises and settles. Joy appears and fades. None of it needs to be controlled. None of it needs to be chased away. You stop micromanaging your inner world. Peace grows, not because emotions disappear, but because they are allowed to move freely. This level of letting go also changes how you experience difficulty in life. Challenges still arise, but they no longer feel overwhelming. You meet them with curiosity instead of panic. You ask, what is this moment asking of me, rather than why is this happening to me? This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Life stops feeling like a series of attacks and starts feeling like a process you are part of. Buddhism teaches that resistance is rooted in the illusion of control, the belief that if you resist hard enough, life will change direction. When you see that resistance does not alter reality, you naturally release it. Energy that was once spent on inner conflict becomes available for clarity, wisdom, and compassion. You act when action is needed, and you rest when rest is required. There is no urgency, no forcing. When resistance ends, relationships also soften. You stop trying to make people different so that you can feel at ease. You stop taking their behavior as proof of your worth. You accept people as they are, and you accept yourself as you are. This acceptance does not mean tolerating harm. It means responding from clarity instead of reaction. Boundaries become calm instead of defensive. At this depth, even the desire to be free loosens. You stop striving for enlightenment, peace, or healing as future achievements. You recognize that this moment, as it is already complete. There is nothing to fix before you can be present. There is nothing to resolve before you can rest. This is the paradox Buddhism points to. Freedom arrives when the search ends. Life becomes gentler when you stop resisting it, not because life changes, but because you do. You stop meeting each moment with tension. You stop bracing for impact. You stop preparing for disappointment. You trust yourself to meet what arises. This trust creates inner stability that does not depend on circumstances. At this stage, suffering becomes optional in a very real way. Pain may still appear, but it no longer turns into a story. It no longer defines your identity. It no longer demands meaning. It simply passes through awareness and leaves. This does not make you detached from life, it makes you deeply present within it. When resistance ends, gratitude appears quietly, not gratitude for outcomes, but gratitude for existence itself. You appreciate moments not because they are perfect, but because they are real. You stop waiting for life to improve before you allow yourself to be at peace. Peace becomes your starting point, not your reward. This is the final teaching of letting go. Not letting go of life, but letting go of the fight with life. When the fight ends, suffering has nowhere to live. The heart becomes spacious. The mind becomes still. Life unfolds without opposition. When you stop resisting what is, life stops hurting you in the way it once did. Not because it spares you from difficulty, but because you no longer meet difficulty with fear and tension. You meet it with openness, awareness, and quiet strength. This is the deepest form of freedom Buddhism offers, a freedom that does not escape life, but fully embraces it, a peace that does not depend on conditions, a gentleness that comes from no longer being at war with the present moment. 12. When you no longer fear losing yourself, you are finally free. At the deepest layer of letting go, there is one final fear that quietly governs almost every human decision, the fear of losing yourself. Not losing people, not losing comfort, not losing stability, but losing the sense of who you think you are. Buddhism teaches that this fear is the final illusion the mind must release. As long as you believe there is a fixed self that must be protected, defended, and preserved, suffering continues in subtle forms. True freedom begins when this fear softens and the grip on identity loosens. Most suffering is not caused by events, but by how those events threaten the image you hold of yourself. You suffer when rejection challenges your sense of worth. You suffer when failure threatens your identity as capable or strong. You suffer when change disrupts the story you tell yourself about who you are and where you are going. Buddhism teaches that the self you are trying to protect is not as solid as it appears. It is a collection of memories, roles, beliefs, emotions, and habits, all of which are constantly changing. When you cling to this collection as if it were permanent, fear naturally arises. Letting go deeply at this level means seeing that you are not the story, you are the awareness in which the story unfolds. Experiences come and go, identities form and dissolve, but awareness remains steady. When you recognize this, the fear of losing yourself begins to fade, because you see that nothing essential has ever been at risk. You were never the roles you played, the labels you carried, or the expectations you lived under. You were always the presence observing them. Many people resist letting go of identity because they believe it will make them empty, lost, or meaningless. Buddhism teaches the opposite. When rigid identity dissolves, life becomes more vivid. You respond instead of react. You adapt instead of resist. You become flexible instead of fragile. When you no longer need to be a specific version of yourself, you gain access to a deeper authenticity. You stop performing, you stop proving, you stop defending, you simply live. This release also transforms how you experience loss. Loss hurts deeply when it feels like a piece of you has been taken away. When identity loosens, loss still brings sadness, but it no longer feels like annihilation. You grieve without collapsing, you remember without clinging, you move forward without betraying the past. Buddhism teaches that grief becomes unbearable only when identity is fused with what was lost. As fear of losing yourself dissolves, control naturally weakens. You no longer need to manage every outcome to protect your image. You no longer need certainty to feel safe. You trust your ability to meet life as it unfolds. This trust is not confidence in success, it is confidence in awareness. You know that whatever arises, you will still be here, present and intact. At this depth, comparison also fades. You stop measuring your life against others because you are no longer trying to validate a self-image. Someone else's success no longer diminishes you. Someone else's path no longer threatens yours. Buddhism teaches that comparison is a form of identity defense. When identity softens, comparison loses its purpose. Letting go of fear also changes how you experience vulnerability. Vulnerability no longer feels dangerous because there is no rigid self to protect. You can be seen without fear of exposure. You can be misunderstood without losing your center. You can be wrong without feeling erased. This openness is not weakness, it is profound inner stability. At this stage, even the desire to be unhurt dissolves. You no longer seek immunity from pain. You understand that pain is part of life, but suffering is not mandatory. You allow experience to move through you without labeling it as threat. Buddhism teaches that the unbreakable mind is not one that avoids pain, but one that does not fear it. This final letting go also brings deep compassion. When you see that others are also clinging to fragile identities, you understand their fear, their defensiveness, and their mistakes. Compassion arises naturally, without effort. Not because you are morally superior, but because you see clearly. Hatred dissolves when understanding deepens. As identity loosens, silence becomes meaningful. You no longer need constant stimulation, explanation, or validation. Being becomes enough. Sitting quietly feels complete. This silence is not emptiness in the negative sense. It is fullness without clutter. Buddhism teaches that this silence is the natural state of the mind when grasping ends. When you no longer fear losing yourself, death itself loses some of its terror, not because it disappears, but because the rigid sense of me has softened. You understand life as a process, not a possession. You participate fully, but you do not cling. This acceptance does not make life less precious. It makes it more intimate. This is the final freedom, not freedom from experience, but freedom within it. You are no longer driven by fear of loss, fear of failure, or fear of becoming nothing. You see that what you truly are was never dependent on circumstances. You stop protecting an image and start living honestly. When fear of losing yourself ends, you no longer need life to go a certain way to feel safe. You no longer need control to feel grounded. You no longer need permanence to feel at peace. You are present, flexible, and deeply alive. This is what it means to let go completely, not to disappear, but to be free from fear, not to lose yourself, but to discover that what you truly are was never fragile. When nothing needs to be protected, nothing can truly be threatened, and in that realization, you rest in a quiet, unshakable peace. When you look back at everything you have learned, you begin to see a simple truth beneath all the words. Suffering was never proof that life was against you. It was proof that the heart was holding on too tightly. You were not broken by what happened. You were exhausted by carrying it longer than necessary. Buddhism does not teach you how to escape life. It teaches you how to stop fighting it. Letting go deeply does not mean becoming indifferent to the world. It means becoming intimate with it, without being trapped by it. You still feel joy, but you no longer cling to it in fear of losing it. You still feel sadness, but you no longer drown in it. You still love, but you no longer disappear inside love. Life continues to move, but it no longer drags you with it. You walk with it, calmly and consciously. When attachment loosens, something quiet and powerful takes its place. Awareness, presence, acceptance. You stop demanding that the past change. You stop chasing a future that promises completion. You arrive fully in the only place peace has ever lived, this moment. Not because it is perfect, but because it is real. You begin to understand that nothing was ever meant to stay forever. Not people, not emotions, not identities, not pain. And because of this, nothing was ever meant to be owned. When you stop owning experience, experience stops owning you. Loss no longer defines you. Change no longer threatens you. Uncertainty no longer terrifies you. You become steady, not because life becomes stable, but because you do. This is the quiet strength Buddhism points toward. A strength that does not harden the heart, but softens it. A strength that does not dominate life, but flows with it. When resistance ends, peace does not need to be created. It reveals itself naturally. When fear dissolves, love becomes lighter. When the need to be complete disappears, wholeness is discovered. Nothing can truly hurt you anymore when nothing is held too tightly. Pain may still visit, but it does not stay. Loss may still arrive, but it does not empty you. Life may still challenge you, but it no longer breaks you. You remain present, grounded, and awake. This is not the end of the path. It is the end of the struggle. From here, life continues, but it feels different, softer, wider, more honest. You no longer need to protect yourself from experience. You trust yourself to meet it. And in that trust, in that openness, in that gentle release, you discover the deepest peace a human being can know.